Welcome back to this series on Herman Dooyeweerd's Roots of Western Culture. In this episode, we're going to start looking at Chapter 5 and the themes of Reformation and Accommodation. Central to Dooyeweerd's argument throughout this book is the claim that the Christian ground motive is transformative. It transforms one's entire view of reality at its root. So that if we do not allow this ground motive to be at the heart of our life and thought, then other ground motives will step in and influence us. So Dooyeweerd wants to present us with a choice. We must be self-consciously grounded in the creation, fall, redemption ground motive so that it can direct us at the most fundamental level. If we do not, we will, consciously or not, allow other ground motives to play that role. Now, the early Christians had to face the threats and influence of non-Christian religions, but also of the thoughts that had developed within the context of those religions. Now, Dooyeweerd identifies these religions as being torn by an inner conflict, and there are two key characteristics of them: that they were ignorant of God the Creator as the absolute origin of all things, and also of humankind in the roots of its being. And this lack of knowledge necessarily influenced human thinking. And yet, at the same time, the thought of the Greek philosophers was certainly impressive and not without its insights. So facing the Christians was the choice to perhaps accept or reject this tradition. But to reject this tradition of thinking would be a great mistake. It would also require creating a closed and cut-off cultural environment, something completely against the universal task of the Great Commission and the claims of Christ as Lord of all. Dooyeweerd explains that the Christian Church realized the enormous danger with which the Greek Zoroastrian ground motive posed for the pure ground motive of divine revelation. And so in this context, the Apostolic Church Fathers formulated the doctrine of the Trinity and maintained the unbreakable unity of the Old and New Testaments, and so succeeded in resisting and overcoming the threat that's posed by the religious dualism found in Gnosticism. However, and this is part of Dooyeweerd's point, this did not completely break the influence of the Greek ground motive. Dooyeweerd focuses on Augustine as an example of the great struggle of the Church Fathers against the Greek ground motive. It's important to notice that the choice, as Dooyeweerd sees it, was not between acceptance and rejection of Greek philosophy. Instead, he formulates it as a choice between reformation and accommodation. His assessment is that the Church Fathers did not significantly appreciate that philosophical thought must take its direction from a religious ground motive. And this means that using a conceptual framework taken from Greek philosophy to help articulate Christian thought will inevitably carry over some of the influence of the Greek religious ground motive, even when the content that it's given is Christian. So if Greek philosophy is interpreted in the light of its religious ground motive, then its insights can be carried over and transformed by the Christian ground motive. Dooyeweerd's approach then to interpreting the influence of ground motives has an important self-critical element. Now, Augustine was influenced by the idea that theory, as intellectual contemplation, was the path to true knowledge of God, and this led to a tendency to view theological theory as being identical to the Christian religion. So Dooyeweerd writes, "For him, the soul was an immortal substance characterized by the faculty of theoretical thought. The body was merely a material vehicle of the rational soul." Now, one of the consequences in Augustine's thought is the way he linked original sin with sexual desire. So the body becomes identified with sin, while the intellect gets elevated as characteristic of the soul and as part of the way of salvation. Dooyeweerd does not want to take away from Augustine his genuine striving to conform his thoughts to the biblical ground motive. But his point is that a lack of radical criticism of the Greek ground motive led to its continuing influence. Dooyeweerd now begins his discussion of what he calls the Roman Catholic ground motive, although it's important to recognize that this ground motive is not limited to the Roman Catholic Church or Roman Catholic Christians. And also, Dooyeweerd talks about Roman Catholics as our fellow Christians. So although it's critical, it's not dismissive. Now, the idea of this ground motive is that the Greek form matter motive is to some extent Christianized and limited to the nature pole of this new ground motive. Nature is understood as what's all hold in common, both in terms of the natural world around us, but also the cultural world as shaped by human nature. Those things that are distinctively Christian are then thought to be gifts of grace that are added to our shared human nature. This way of thinking is very intuitive for us. Just like my neighbours, I have a family. I share hobbies and interests with my neighbours. I get educated, work, pay taxes and vote, and so on. Unlike some of my neighbours, I pray, read the Bible and go to church. Now, the first list involves the common and natural part of my life. The second is the religious or spiritual or Christian parts of my life. Now, as tempting as this view may appear, it cannot in any way do justice to the claim of Christ to be Lord of all, to be the one who holds all things together, and which therefore opposes any split between the natural and the religious. Dooyeweerd's ground motive analysis then is a way of showing us and helping us understand how the idea of a religious part of life, separate from a common or natural part of our lives, has come to seem so natural. The issue at stake with the nature grace motive is that its success in holding elements of different ground motives together is also its weakness, because it leaves ambiguous and hidden the religious ground motives that influence our thought and action. This also prevents the Christian ground motive of creation, fall and redemption from having its proper influence on our lives. So Dooyeweerd wants to awaken us to the choice between what he calls Reformation and Accommodation. He writes, "It is an urgent matter that we, openly and regardless of who is involved, choose sides in the issue, Reformation or Accommodation." Dooyeweerd turns to Thomas Aquinas as the primary kind of intellectual representative of the nature grace motive. And we should remember, of course, that Roots is originally a series of newspaper articles, and that he's trying to get at the deep religious ground motives that influence Western thought and culture. So this brief discussion of Aquinas shouldn't be considered a kind of full and complete kind of philosophical and scholarly exploration of his thought, which is surely very deep and wide and worth serious consideration. This should be clear also by the way that Dooyeweerd moves from talking about the Roman Catholic Church as much as he talks about Aquinas the thinker himself. So, for example, he writes, "To the Church of Rome today, grace is not everything, for otherwise grace would swallow up nature." So Dooyeweerd is appealing to his Reformed Christian audience that we should not think in terms of a specially Christian sphere, which is separated from a natural sphere that we all share in common with non-Christians. Today it's become much more common among Christians to oppose a sacred secular split. Unfortunately, this opposition is more in words than deed, because we haven't fully understood the depth and nature of the ground motives that Dooyeweerd believes underlies this way of thinking. And so without an idea of creation, fall and redemption in its integral and radical sense, Christians of all traditions are unable to go beyond the nature grace scheme that Dooyeweerd here analyzes. So turning to Aquinas, we see that he has a much more positive view of the body than Augustine did, but he still relates the body to the principle of matter and to imperfection, and he views the soul as rational. He continually called the thinking soul the rational form of the human nature divine, says Dooyeweerd. He never referred to matter as divine. This shows the influence of Greek philosophy, which itself was determined by the form matter ground motive, and so prevents the full influence of the Christian ground motive. The nature grace ground motive often sees nature as leading on to grace, particularly through the use of human reason. And so Dooyeweerd considers an attempt to defend this based on Romans 1 verses 19 to 20, and he argues here that the text gives no evidence that knowledge of God is derived by the natural light of reason. Instead, the text says that such knowledge is given as revelation from God. God has shown it to them, says St. Paul. Dooyeweerd then considers an example of the supposed natural light of reason in action, the first of Aquinas' famous 5 ways. The argument from movement leads from the reality of change in the world to an unmoved mover, a God of pure form. Dooyeweerd suggests that this whole argument already presupposes the priority of the Greek form motive, and shows that it can be effectively reversed by starting with the relative forms of things in the world, and thereby prove the divinity of the eternal flux of life out of which these forms necessarily arise, as taught in the matter motive. Dooyeweerd also considers Romans 2 verses 14 and 15, which talks of the Gentiles who have not the law, but do by nature what the law requires. And he rejects the interpretation that this points towards a rational natural law that is known by the light of reason. He points that the law is written on our hearts, not written in a rational mind or soul, and this is an indication of the religious depths of creation, while also the context here in Romans is the radical motive of the fall. Dooyeweerd writes that what is the sin of heathens if they know the law for creation only rationally, and if this law is not engraved into their hearts, into the root of their being? Dooyeweerd now discusses how the nature-grace ground motive influences the views on society. He writes that Aquinas considered the state to be based on the rational nature of human beings, with its natural predisposition towards society. This social propensity develops in stages through the formation of smaller and larger communities that are mutually related in terms of lower to higher, means to ends, part to whole. At the lower end of this hierarchy, the sensuous desires of the body are satisfied in the family. At the higher, rational end is the state, which completes human society and keeps the lower desires in check. This picture of society in terms of a whole-part scheme, ordered from lower to higher, brings out Dooyeweerd's deep concern with the threat of totalitarianism, a reminder of the post-Second World War context. He worries about Aquinas' view of the state as the all-inclusive community in the realm of nature. Nevertheless, Dooyeweerd recognizes that the Thomists were faithful to Aquinas in opposing fascism, for Aquinas sets the supernatural order of the Church and the participation of individuals and marriage in the sacraments as outside the competence of the state. Further, the principle of subsidiarity, where the state is constructed from below in a hierarchy of lower and higher communities, also provides a defense against totalitarian government. However, he argues that it is sphere sovereignty, with its notion of the intrinsic nature of the life spheres, that is a more robust anti-totalitarian principle. With sphere sovereignty, there is no place for a part-whole view of society and the state.